The following is a conversation with Robert Breedlove, someone who caught my attention and was recommended highly as a rigorous scholar and thinker in the space of decentralized finance and Bitcoin. His podcast, titled What is Money, is a good representation of the way his mind works. He's willing to talk through ideas for many hours, willing to listen, willing to think, which makes him a great companion in conversation to explore the history, philosophy, and future of money. Quick mention of our sponsors: Fundrise, Element, MonkPack, and BetterHelp. Check them out in the description to support this podcast. As a side note, let me say that I'll have a number of conversations in the coming months on Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. None of these conversations are financial advice. That's not a legal warning. That's a genuine description of my goals and approach with these chats. At least for a while, I personally won't actively invest in Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrencies, except to learn about the technology itself. I don't think this should be a journalistic standard like the New York Times trying to establish, which I very much disagree with. In my humble opinion, I think journalists should be free to invest in Bitcoin if they want to. Luckily, I'm not a journalist. I just know my own psychology, and I feel that my thinking will be muddled by excitement if I invest before I understand. I feel the same way about Tesla, for example. I still don't own any Tesla stock, and I am still indeed fascinated by Tesla Autopilot as an artificial intelligence system. I work hard to be cognizant of the biases that arise in my mind and always try to choose the path that maximizes or maintains a freedom of thought as much as possible. Also, let me say that I try to be very careful in selecting guests based not only on the contents of their ideas, but the richness, complexity, music, style of their mind and character. Yes, I will talk with people with whom you and I may disagree, people who some may call bad or even evil human beings. I want to understand them because I believe that, as Solzhenitsyn said, the battle line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man. I think if you always run from evil, you become blind to the truth of human nature. This is the Lex Fridman podcast, and here is my conversation with Robert Breedlove. Rousseau opens his 1762 book, The Social Contract, with the following statement: "Man is born free, and everywhere he's in chains." So you talk about freedom and sovereignty quite a bit. What do these ideas mean to you, the idea of sovereignty?
Freedom and sovereignty, I think they're very closely related. Let's start just focusing on sovereignty, which is a word I don't think we talk about enough. And the general definition of that I would give is the authority to act as you see fit. And it's a word that's etymologically associated with words like monarchy, money, reign. So historically, it's referred to whatever the locus of supreme power is in the sphere of human action. So if you go like back into ancient Egypt, the pharaoh had absolute sovereignty and everyone else was pretty much operating according to his interest. You fast forward to today, modern Western democracy, we have more decentralized sovereignty in that we all get to go vote and elect officials that make decisions on our behalf. So the theme of sovereignty across history is that it's been gradually decentralizing across our different models of socioeconomics. And it's largely, you could say it's rooted heavily in the money, I would argue, which is something we'll get a lot into here, where if you have money, you have the authority to act as you see fit in the world. And even in our current political sphere, if you have enough money, you can actually reshape the rules, right? You can reshape laws, you can lobby Congress. If you're in a certain situation like many billionaires, you can negotiate your own tax treaty such that you can get favorable tax treatment with certain jurisdictions in the world. So this concept of sovereignty, which today it's common to call states or nation states or governments sovereign, meaning that they have power over people. But as I argue in a lot of my writing, I actually think that sovereignty inheres within the individual and that we each have our own interiorized space of choice, which is something like Viktor Frankl called the final human freedom. and that we, no matter what our circumstances are, no matter what exogenous situation we face, we always have this endogenous power to choose how we respond to it.
That's one of my favorite books is Man's Search for Meaning. Maybe we can break that apart a little bit. So you've kind of spoken about sovereignty as closely linked to power, but is there something about your own mind being able to achieve sovereignty no matter what the monetary system is, no matter who has the control over centralized power or the money or whatever the mechanisms of sovereignty at the societal level? You as an individual, isn't ultimately all boiled down to what you can do with your own mind, how you see the world, how you interpret it?
Yeah, I agree. And as we get a little bit deeper into this, I think we'll come to see money as an extension of your mind. So there's a feedback between money and mind. For instance, you think in dollars today, almost guarantee it.
Yes.
Most of us do here in the U.S.
Yes.
And it's a tool, right? It's a tool we're using to decomplexify the world around us, to deal with it, to understand the sacrifices and successes across an entire history of economic transactions. We can boil that all down to the price. So it's data compression. And if you can change, if there's a central body or central governance mechanism that can manipulate that money, it can have an impact on your mind. For instance, today, so I agree with you on the first hand, say that I do believe in free will. I do believe in individual autonomy. But I also think that there are certain devices and powers in the world around us that can actually influence how we think.
And it's fascinating to think about the fact that money might be actually deeply integrated into the way we think and into our mind. Like this is, you think about what are the core aspects of the human mind? What influences cognition, the way you reason about the world? You have the Chomsky, like language is at the core of everything. But you're kind of placing money as pretty close to the core of what it means to be an intelligent, reasoning human.
I think money is a direct derivation of action and speech, actually. It's another expression of the logos. If we even think of what it means to think, is that we are generating two different courses of action, potential courses of action, and we're populating them with avatars, right? Maybe ourselves or others, and then we're comparing how we may act in each situation and what we think the result would be. So actually, it's comparison. Basically, it's comparison and contrasting of possible courses of action. And that's the same thing with words themselves. Like, most words, the vast majority of words only have meaning in relationship to other words, right? It's all contextual. Definitions of a word are more words. Now, people have argued with me about this because there is a first word, right, where you pick up rock and say rock. But most other words and much in higher abstraction tend to be relative. And what's funny about action and speech, and I got into a bit of this in our paper here, is that it's linked to evolutionary biology. And that once human beings adopted upright stance, we freed our hands. We no longer needed our hands for locomotion. So we started to evolve more dexterity. And notably, we have opposable thumbs. So this gives us an ability to manipulate and particularize the environment in a way that most other animals cannot. And what's interesting about this is that as we gain this ability to manipulate natural resources and count, pointing was a big deal, and that we could indicate prey or items at a far off distance, and we could organize ourselves. We at the same time we co-evolved this fine musculature in the face and tongue. So it's as if speech co-evolved really with our dexterity. And as a natural extension of that came us making tools, right? We started to create things to better satisfy our wants over time. And the most tradable tool in any society, or the most tradable thing, is money. So I argue that action and speech are quintessential modes of self-sovereign expression, and that money is just sort of a tech layer we've put right on top of that, and that it's a natural derivation of action and speech.
Okay, that's fascinating to think about sovereignty from the evolutionary perspective. And then ultimately, money is the technology layer that enables sovereignty. So, it's really fascinating to think about our modern human society as deeply rooted in these like evolutionary roots from the very origins of life on Earth. So, what, some of the ideas you just mentioned, what do you see are some interesting characteristics of just life on Earth that propagated to us humans? Like, what ideas propagated through have roots in the evolution?
Yeah. I think one of the deepest impulsions in life is the territorial imperative. So all life is seeking to expand its dominion over space and time. And we think about, again, physically with space, it's advantageous to an animal or an organism to have more territory under its control to raise offspring. So it's all about reproductive fitness at the end of the day. And then we could also think of reproduction itself as the genetic impulse to have more, to replicate oneself across time. So it's territoriality across time in a way. And this is very common in most animals. Not all animals are territorial, but many are. And you see very interesting behaviors resulting from territoriality. This is like animal combat. The reason birds sing is territoriality, a number of other things. And it's my hypothesis, and others have shared this hypothesis as well, that mankind is clearly, I think, would argue a territorial species, and that he expresses this territoriality in property rights. So property, when we hear that word, we typically think of an asset. We think of, this house or this stock or whatever. But property is actually the socially acknowledged relationship between a human and an asset, such that you have exclusive rights and responsibilities to a particular asset. It is not the asset itself. So property, it's information. It's a relationship.
By the way, my mind was just blown. Property is information. It's not the actual asset. That's really important.
Very important.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. And then it comes down to how do we organize ourselves such that property, that the contributions people are making are commensurate with the consideration they're receiving. So if you're adding value to a piece of property, you're developing a piece of land for use, in theory, like to be fair, you should have the rights to that fruit, right? If you go out and plant a garden or whatever it may be. And this is this is rooted in natural law, where we have rights to life, liberty, and property. Those are kind of just the fundamental layer of morality and capitalism, frankly. And you could think of, to get really primordial with it, the first capitalist in the world, just to kind of get some definitions out here, I'll say capitalism versus communism or socialism as the spectrum I'll speak on. The first capitalist in the world would be the guy, the caveman, that maybe dug a little hole for himself to shield himself from the elements, right? Maybe there was a rainstorm or a snowstorm and he dug a little enclave and he protected himself.
I thought you were going to go, because you said primordial, I thought you were going to go back to like earlier biological systems.
I guess primordial for human, perhaps.
For humans, yeah. Okay.
And then the first communist or socialist would be someone that decided the fruits of his labor belonged to him. So he would have violently encroached on that individual and taken his plot for himself, for his own use. And that's the spectrum across which capitalism in the pure sense and communism in the pure sense operate. In that capitalism, each individual has the exclusive rights to the fruits of their labor. So anything they spend their time, effort, energy creating in the world, they own the rights to that, and they can trade those rights with others, other self-owned people that have done similar things. Communism or socialism would imply that other people, typically the state, have the rights, at least some rights to the value you've created.
So there's this interesting moment when that first caveman, that first capitalist, drew a line, a circle in this cave and said, this is mine. You could say it was free to be claimed at the time he claimed it.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting moment when asset becomes an asset. When space-time, as you were referring to, it becomes something that's now can be possessed by a human being.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something special about this moment? Because it feels like, first of all, in terms of space and time, it feels like there's a lot of available space time yet to be claimed. So if we just look at like the universe, right? We're talking about, there's a funny thing with Elon Musk and Mars. I think they sneaked in there for SpaceX that nobody on Earth has any authority on Mars or any. Oh, this is a very interesting question. It seems almost like humorous at this time, but perhaps not. Perhaps there'll be sections of space, not just on planets, that are going to be even fought over. So is there something special about this moment? Because in discussing sort of violence and respect for property, it feels like this is a special moment because ultimately conflict arises when you make claims on a particular territory. It's not always in conflict where people say, when you look at Hitler or something, for example, his claim would be in many of the lands that he attacked and invaded that this has always belonged to Germany. So is there something you could say as to like what it means to own an asset or a property?
Yeah. So in the ancient days of hunters and gatherers, we could say that property was mostly a allodial title, which meant it's just whatever you can defend, right? So if you've got knives and daggers and satchels and maybe some pelts you've hunted, whatever you can hold and defend is yours. And there's not like there's a government to appeal to. You're just sort of a free agent operating in the wild, defending the assets you can protect on you, more or less. And what really changed the nature of property is when we get into the agricultural age. So there's a big flip where we went from just foraging and hunting all the time, constantly moving, trying to stay alive, to deciding we're going to settle here. We figured out how to cultivate crops. We can create, we can increase the population because we can harvest more energy from the sun, and we can establish a longer term civilization. What happens in that transition is that we begin creating economic surplus. So for the first time in history, we have, grain, stock houses of grain to defend, or maybe meat or cattle or whatever it is we're creating. We now have savings. And it's at that time when government emerges as well. Because once you have savings or you have an economic surplus, you have something that other people want to steal, right? This one thing we'll touch on a lot today is people always want something for nothing. People are always seeking the path to get something for nothing. And I think that drives a lot of our decision making. And it actually encourages us to be innovative in a lot of ways, right? We're trying to, you could say it's our laziness that's helping us be inventive in a way. We're trying to accomplish greater results with less efforts over time. But we can cross that line in seeking something for nothing where we start to violate the life, liberty, and property of others. And that's where we shift from kind of capitalistic society to something more communistic. And so that's what government is. It's a protection-producing enterprise for the economic surplus generated by a trading society. So when people begin to trade, they create what's called the division of labor, which is a very common economics term. Basically means you're better at making hats, I'm better at making boots. If you specialize in hats, I specialize in boots, and we trade, we've created a positive sum game where you and I both benefit. So we become collectively more than the sum of our parts through trade. And that's why human beings do trade, because we become more energy efficient as a result. We create more outputs per unit of input. And you could think of government in that respect, if we're looking at it maybe in a tech sense, that the economy is the trade network that generates wealth, generates innovation, generates all this whole lap of luxury we live in today that we've inherited from our forebears is from the market. It's not from a government. The government is the network security, if you will. So we're paying expenses to a vendor to protect peace, to preserve life, liberty, and property in that network, so that we can have, when there's inevitably disputes over private property, we can have nonviolent dispute resolution in the rule of law. And we can have a reasonable expectation of being able to conduct commerce without violence. The problem has been that the protector tends to, they're in a monopolistic position, we would say. They tend to start abusing that position to obtain property for themselves. Again, trying to get that something for nothing, When you control, you are the security guard for the economy. The first thing they tend to monopolize is money, because if you can control the money, you're effectively controlling people, their energy, their perceptions. And that becomes particularly through inflation, becomes an avenue to get something for nothing. And that you can just print more money that everyone else is forced to sacrifice their time and energy to obtain.
What are your thoughts about anarchism? So I talked quite a bit. He'll be here in a few days, actually, Michael Malice, about ideas of anarchy. And his idea, or the idea of anarchists, is that any amount of government will eventually become the very kind of thing that you're referring to. So there's almost no way to have a government that doesn't then try to monopolize power, money, and all those kinds of things. Do you think it's possible to have a government sort of on that spectrum of like anarchy, maybe libertarianism? I'm not sure how exactly the spectrum goes, but where you have a small government that protects the liberty and property rights and those kinds of things and doesn't expand to then also control the monetary system and all those other things. Is it possible?
Agreed completely. It was not possible until Satoshi Nakamoto. So for the first time in history, we have a money that cannot be monopolized, cannot be corrupted, cannot be changed, cannot be weaponized, frankly. Our current monetary system is weaponized by those who can print money against those who cannot. And I think when you have, at the heart of every modern economy, which even we could say the US, we pride ourselves as free market capitalists. We outcompeted communism in the 20th century. We think that this is the superior model. Most business people will tell you that the free market is the best allocator of resources, all of these things. But what we have at the heart of every modern economy, including the US, is an anti-capitalistic institution, which is the central bank. The temptation to monopolize money throughout all of history has been too strong for anyone to resist. So even benevolent, quote unquote, dictators that have taken over, many dictators have inherited, say, an inflationary regime where society's coming apart because someone was clipping the coins or someone was printing too much money, and they'll commit to going back to a hard money standard. So they'll keep society on a gold standard, for instance, such that they cannot violate the money to benefit themselves. But inevitably over time, because it is a political institution, there's an incentive there, right? For again, to get something for nothing, to spend more than you're making through tax revenues. And with that incentive, people typically ultimately end up pursuing that inflationary path. So we get deeper into that about inflation is a term that we've been conditioned to think today is just something normal, that prices just go up and then it's pertinent to a healthy economy, but it's actually, if you look at it from real first principles, it is just theft integrated into the money. It's a technology backdoor is another way to think about it. You wouldn't buy a cell phone knowing that someone could siphon your data off of your private calls and sell it into the market. Now, I know we do that with a lot of social media stuff today, and that's something else we can get into, but you wouldn't do it willingly, right? You would prefer that your cell phone and your data was monetized by you, or if you're going to sell it, you would be able to selectively sell it. Inflation is that. It's similar. It's a tech backdoor. So it's a money that only a few people can siphon value off of surreptitiously, typically slowly, but eventually, as we've seen throughout history, that slowly builds up into a rapidly and then causes the monetary system to collapse.
Do you think there's a benefit to inflation? Possibly. So when you have perfect information, but perhaps you don't need inflation. Perhaps it is purely theft. But I think of inflation as like the snooze button on the alarm. Like you just, so if you have a hard standard, you better wake up when the alarm rings. But, all of us kind of like probably shouldn't, but use the snooze button. It's like, okay, well, 5 more minutes or 10 more minutes. And then you're saying there's naturally a slippery slope where it becomes a drug that you fall in love with and you abuse.
That's right.
But nevertheless, the usefulness of the snooze button is that you don't know how you'll be actually feeling when the alarm rings. You might be able to ready to pop up, or you might be like you really need those few more minutes, like to psychologically get yourself out of bed. This metaphor is just not working at all. But
No,
but do you
it's
think
what it
there's a
does.
use to inflation sometimes from like an economics perspective?
I think the drug metaphor is a little more apt in that inflation does provide an immediately stimulative effect when used early on. So, but what it's doing is again, we talk about the balance between incentives and disincentives, right? That being necessary for a system to function properly. If with inflation, you're essentially giving the people that can print money a way to dampen the disincentives they face. So it destroys feedback loops, I guess you might say. And another way to look at this is using inflation, using quantitative easing, you can decrease short-term volatility in the marketplace. So the market is basically this form of free exchange that's trying to zero in on the best ideas. And the ideas are those that are most fit to reality, to satisfying the most wants. It's going to overshoot, it's going to undershoot. You have these little business cycles. But when it's undershooting and you're experiencing business recession, in a capitalist environment, the market needs to clear that malinvestment, that misallocation of capital. That means someone made a bet on a certain idea that it would satisfy wants in a particular way, and that bet did not pan out. If you then paper over the losses that business is creating, you're now delaying and exacerbating the volatility that idea created. So this is kind of a Talebian concept where you can dampen short-run volatility, but volatility is truth. Volatility is us matching our ideas to reality, right? We're constantly, again, overshooting and undershooting. So if you delay volatility, you're just amplifying it and exacerbating it in the long run. And that's what central bank is doing. The central bank mandate is low unemployment and low and expected inflation, basically. And so they're trying to achieve economic growth in a stable way, quote unquote, stable way. This is their ostensible purpose. And that's just not possible. Growth is an inherently unstable process.
Can you elaborate a little bit about the nature of volatility? Why is it communicating truth? That's something that a lot of people are afraid of, is the volatility. Almost like it's a sign of chaos, and so they want to escape chaos. But you're saying that that's actually whether it's chaos or not, I don't know, but it's getting us closer to the fundamental like reality that we should not be trying to escape.
Yeah. So if we consider that the universe is pervaded by entropy, right? This is the second law of thermodynamics, is that every closed system tends towards greater disorder over time. And that life itself, again, I would argue expressed through the logos, life is the anti-entropic principle. It's the only thing that's converting entropy into order, chaos into order. And that's what entrepreneurs are doing, right? We're living at the edges of the known, and we're testing ourselves against the entropy of nature, trying to figure out new and better ways of saying, doing, or making things. And then if we do crack a code or figure something out, we then have a big incentive. The incentive is to get rich, right? Because then you have a new idea that you could then sell back into the marketplace. So it's this sequence of courageously confronting the entropy of nature and converting it into good and useful order, which, by the way, is like the ancient idea of God in Genesis, which I think is interesting, that actually enables us to construct civilization in these layers of anti-entropy or order, you might say. So today we live in a bubble of anti-entropy or order, like the coastlines are guarded by the nation, and the city has a certain police force that keeps it in order. Even the way we talk, like clearly the words matter, but also the nonverbal cues. All these things are like order that has been established over many, many, many thousands of years of human evolution. And I think that when I say volatility is truth, what I'm saying is that the experience of uncertainty is something that's ineradicable from life, right? Uncertainty, it's kind of a paradox because we're fighting against it, right? We're
Yeah.
trying to innovate our way away from uncertainty to create more capital, which capital is very simply a way of mitigating uncertainty. So this is why you might have like a stash of food in case, the power goes out, or a generator. Like, it helps you overcome uncertainty over time. But uncertainty is also where all the sweetness of life is. So there's got to be this balance with one foot in, one foot out. And
So human society is this kind of bubble of order that we've constructed and slowly
yes,
expanding. But at the edges, you're always going to have that chaos, that volatility, and that the entrepreneurs are kind of like jumping into that chaos, and some
yes,
of them die, and
yes,
some of them succeed. And so, like, if you want to grow this bubble of order, you have to be embracing the volatility at the edges.
yes.
That
And reverence for entrepreneurship, because these are the people putting their neck out, so to speak, risking themselves. And they're going to contribute to society, by the way, whether they go up in flames or not. If they go up in flames, society has witnessed their experience as something not to do, or something that doesn't work in a particular time and place. So that you could say them going up in flames is a way of enlightening the rest of us. Or if they figure something
That's
out,
poetry.
Steve Jobs creates the iPhone, changes the
line.
world forever. So and
Enlightening the rest of us. Okay.
and Taleb would
With
say,
the fire of their failure. Okay.
yeah, exactly. Taleb would say, individual fragility is inseparable from ensemble anti-fragility. So this means that, again, every time that entrepreneur goes up in flames, or say a restaurant goes out of business, when a restaurant goes out of business, that particular cuisine strategy they were implementing in that particular time and place, that's a signal to all the other restaurants in the area that doesn't work. So restaurant food improves from bankruptcy to bankruptcy. So it's this death of the individual components that contributes to the growth of the ensemble.
As a small aside, maybe you can guide me through it. I don't know if you're paying attention, but there was some chaos around Taleb and the Bitcoin community. I wasn't quite paying attention, but from my outsider's perspective, I thought Nassim Taleb was a supporter of Bitcoin, and then a lot of people were very upset about something. I'm sorry if I don't know the details, but can you pull out some profound philosophical ideas from the disagreement of the chaos?
I admittedly don't know too much about it either. I'm a big fan of his writing. He's always been a little different in person. Like, he signed one of my books. I met him in person. He's got a very abrasive personality. He's kind of known for it. It's not, I don't think I'm passing any judgment here. He sort of embraces it.
Yeah.
But he had written the foreword to a really important book in Bitcoin called the Bitcoin Standard for Safety and Amos. Mm-hmm. And then I think they had a little Twitter beef because Safety is very much against COVID mask and state intervention, whereas Taleb's on the other side of the fence.
Right.
And then after that beef, Taleb came out against Bitcoiners saying, oh, Bitcoiners are crazy and wrong.
I think the great mask debate of the 2020 will probably be the thing that ultimately leads to World War III. I've been very surprised how tense, how much like division this one little, arguably silly thing has led to. I think a lot of people sort of project their, like, it's almost like not wearing a mask is a statement of sovereignty, of freedom, of like saying fuck you to the man, the government, the centralized power, or the dishonesty, or the in the scientific community, all those kinds of things. And then wearing a mask is a sort of kind of signaling of various kind of social aspects. I don't know. I'm not paying attention to it. I actually tuned out. I was part of a group of scientists that were looking into, like, do masks work? This very interesting question. To me, it was an interesting question. I sort of roll in to ask that very interesting question because I think it is an interesting scientific question. But then I quickly realized that just as I was doing this like scientific exploration of this very interesting question about virion particles, like what kind of things, like from a scientific perspective, how do we prevent the spread of a pandemic? Forget COVID, any pandemic, super deadly or not deadly. Like, there's tools, there's testing, there's masks, there's all these tools. How well do they work? And then I realized, in April or so, it became a tool of politics, a tool of philosophy, and that's when I sort of pulled out. So it's fascinating. I think it's a canvas on which people project their emotions, and I guess Taleb got caught up in that kind of. So there's nothing fundamental, I suppose, to their disagreement.
Not that I'm aware of, but he is, he's written some about in his books the problem with centralization. I mean, a lot of his writing addresses that, and he actually points to, I think Switzerland is the best government in the world because it's decentralized. So there's that. I don't think he has any. I'm not to speak for him, but I don't think he's voiced any specific critiques on Bitcoin per se. Could be wrong about that.
It's just maybe his flavorful language and the way he likes to communicate.
And the other theory is that maybe he's playing 4D chess and having a Twitter boating accident, So I don't believe in Bitcoin. I've sold all my Bitcoin. And
oh, I see.
Yeah.
What?
Sorry, the boating accident in Bitcoin is this, I guess it's proverbial by this point, where it's the way you lose your Bitcoin. So if someone comes after you and says, hey, whether it's a government or an individual is coming after you saying, give me all your Bitcoin or pay these taxes in Bitcoin, you go, oh, I had a boating accident and lost them all.
Right.
So, yeah.
But back to the fundamental nature of space-time. Let me ask you, because we're kind of left it. I'd like to go back to this idea of that you said that everything we think, say, or do occurs within the bounds of space-time. So first of all, maybe you can comment on what do you mean in this context about space, time, but also about the nature of truth, like how much of all of this is knowable, how much of this is accessible to us humans, how much uncertainty, like what we're talking about, is there in the world? Do you fall in a place where we can reason deeply about this world and it's knowable, or is it mostly chaos and we're just holding on for dear life?
Yeah, I think I said that all action occurs within the bounds of space-time. The other thing, everything we say, do, or make, the other thing is that everything we say, do, or make starts out as an idea. So there's this concept of universal Darwinism, which basically applies Darwinian principles, but outside of the biological sphere. So we could say that this kind of gets into Richard Dawkins' memetics, that even ideas are competing, reproducing, recombining.
That idea is so powerful, by the way. I don't think it's been understood fully. I think in the 21st century, in the digital world, from my perspective, in artificial intelligence, there's yet to be some profound things to be discovered about this whole construct.
Yeah. Agreed completely. It's been called an acid, actually, and that it strips away all of the non-informational components of something, just strips it down to its bare bones. I have a quote in here somewhere about that, but
sorry, which is called an asset? The ideas?
The universal Darwinism.
Darwinism applied broadly, outside of the...
Applied broadly, and I'll condition all of this with saying that most of my thinking is shaped by a book I read recently called The Case Against Reality, which introduced me to this concept, but it tied into Darwinism that I've used more broadly in the past, looking at things like money and economics. So the book, The Case Against Reality by Donald Hoffman, he has a quote in the book that describes universal Darwinism. It says, quote, "Universal Darwinism can, without risk of refuting itself, address our key question. Does natural selection favor true perceptions? If the answer happens to be no, then it hasn't shot itself in the foot. The uncanny power of universal Darwinism has been likened by the philosopher Dan Dennett to a universal acid." And Dan Dennett says, quote, "There is no denying at this point that Darwin's idea is a universal solvent, capable of cutting right to the heart of everything in sight. The question is, what does it leave behind? I have tried to show that once it passes through everything, we are left with stronger, sounder versions of our most important ideas. Some of the traditional details perish, and some of these are losses to be regretted, but good riddance to the rest of them. What remains is more than enough to build on," unquote. So the way I would interpret that is that life itself, I've come to view life as information propagating through flesh. And that we are, I guess, DNA is a quadratic code. I think it's 4 letters maybe versus a binary
Mhm.
zeros and ones. And we are ideas, we are strategies competing with each other. And nature is that which selects. It's what selects the winning ideas, the ones that are most fit to environmental conditions, frankly.
Talking about sovereignty and individualism, there might need to be some rethinking here about what is actually the basic individual entity that is to be sovereign. Like maybe our biological meat vehicles, were like way overly attached to them. Like maybe especially with genetics and all those kinds of things, or artificial intelligence, or living more and more in virtual worlds, will become detached from that kind of idea. So for example, if I can clone you, make make 1 million robbers, and but you'll all have the same idea. What is your real value? Like I could just shoot you and there'll still be 999 of you, but the idea is the important thing.
Yeah.
The things you believe. So
I would argue that I don't know, even if you clone someone perfectly, I don't think you can reproduce the individual themselves, because we're all a product of nature and nurture, right? So my particular concourse of experiences, the path dependence that I represent, cannot be replicated, nor can anyone's, for that matter.
well, that's a hypothesis. So
True.
that's of course a human meat bag would say. So,
point.
so like desperately trying to preserve himself. I think it reduces to some fundamental questions about what is consciousness and whether that can be cloned. All those kind. It gets to the core of what it is to be human. What are the things that make you particularly you?
Yeah, I think it would assume kind of a materialist viewpoint on reality, and that if you could reproduce every atom of an individual, that you would have their experience encapsulated in that. And Hoffman's, which is the book, is very radical. He argues that space and time is not an objective reality, it's a biological interface. So we are scanning our environment for fitness payoffs, and this space and time is the rendering specific to human beings that allows us to navigate reality effectively. So the further argument would be that we all have pretty similar interfaces, but they're all slightly different too, because we're all adapting in different ways, and that different animals have their own unique interfaces. So we have a certain amount of photoreceptors in our eye, whereas I think the number's 3, might be 5, whereas something like the mantis shrimp has like 7 or 9. So they can see, and we only see 1/10 trillionth of the light spectrum. So talk about a tiny fraction. I mean, 1/10 trillionth is a very minuscule number, and that makes up all of the light that we can interpret with our eyes. But something like a mantis shrimp could see, much more of that. So I think there's this, we're very conditioned to have a fully materialist viewpoint on reality today, where we think, the atomic clockwork kind of universe. But I don't think that's true exactly. And another school that goes into that is actually Austrian economics, where we could say that, we mentioned earlier that an asset is not property. It's actually based on the relationship between the individual and the property. There's this whole realm of relevance associated with, we're all moving through life in the course of a goal-directed action. So when we walk across a room, I go from A to B. It's because I valued B more than A. Mm-hmm. So value is inseparable from human action. We have a rank-ordered value system in our mind, each of us, and we're constantly taking action in accordance with those rank values. Anything that accelerates us on the course of our goal-directed action towards our goal is useful. Anything that impedes us, or we could say is valuable, anything that impedes us is actually obstructing to value. And anything that's irrelevant is just valueless. So this table that we're using right now, like this is it's an accessory to you and I, because it's holding this paper that's holding the information that's guiding our conversation. Mm-hmm. But we could pay someone $100 to jump over this table, and this table could simultaneously be an accessory to you and I and an obstacle to someone else. So it's this domain, this silent contention of willpower and agendas occurring across the face of the earth that is what Austrian economics really looks at. It's the realm of human action, as they call it. It's called praxeology. So it's a non-materialist viewpoint on reality, in that things, we think in terms of matter being reality, but it's often more so in the sphere of human action, what matters. That is reality. It's the relevance of a thing to the course of one's goal-directed action.
And that's ultimately, it exists in the space of ideas.
Yes.
Not in the space of physical matter.
Yes. And just to jump back to this line here, I think his fundamental line here is, the question is, talking about universal Darwinism as an asset, what does it leave behind? I've tried to show that once it passes through everything, we're left with stronger, sounder versions of our most useful ideas. That's the key point to me. And that ideas and information, so far as we can tell, are the most fundamental substrate of reality. And information itself, back to entropy, information is the resolution of entropy. That's what the bit is, right? It's a 1 or 0. Whatever reduces your entropy by half is a bit. And we measure information in bits. So,
and you're right. People don't have ideas. Ideas have people. Honestly, it's a really profound idea, or a statement about reality, a reframing of reality. Mm-hmm. It's if we're actually being deeply honest about it, it's quite painful. Mm-hmm. I do appreciate that you defended your biological meat bag earlier, but it seems like ideas are the things that have power. That me, Lex, for example, is worthless, and relative to the ideas that used my brain for a bit of a time.
But so far as we know, only human beings can generate and share ideas. So you can't say Lex is worthless. Like, you are the node of the idea sphere, right? The noosphere. So
I'm what is it? From a Bitcoin perspective, I'm mining. I'm solving the cryptographic problem and generate. I'm a use in that sense. I'm a useful node.
You're competing to solve the puzzle of entropy, right? And when you do solve it, it benefits the entire network.
But I guess from my perspective, just working in AI, I'm looking at the long-term vision. I see us humans and AI systems as really the same, and AI systems ultimately as something that supersedes humans.
So what is intelligence?
So in the context of our current discussion, I think intelligence is very closely linked to this notion of ideas. And it's the ability to generate ideas, to mold ideas, to compress seeming chaos into some model, into some theory that efficiently compresses the chaos in a way where you can then integrate it with other ideas and they can play and all those kinds of things. So in that sense, it's the turning chaos into order. It's the molding of ideas such that our human brains can work with it. And it just, from my perspective, I don't see any reason why that cannot be algorithmatized, converted into computational systems.
I would agree.
Which is scary.
Scary, or potentially really promising, right? It's kind of the case with all novelty. It's terrifying as much as it is promising. That's why you're pursuing it so heavily. But I would maybe take it a step further and say that intelligence, in maybe its most simplistic form, is error correction. So humans have wants. Again, we're constantly expressing our value through action.